Good morning. This is kind of a novelty day for us. Usually we don't get to have a youth service on Easter, and so this is kind of like, if there is a positive in this current situation, we get to do our own little youth Easter service. And so I want to start with that. Happy Easter. Hope everyone's having a great day with their families. Hope you enjoy this holiday. Maybe it gives you a break from this craziness. And I just wanted to share a brief Easter kind of message for y'all that's one specific to our youth group and to what it means to gospelize. And so this morning we're going to look at two parts of two verses. So we're going to look at Mark 15:24, just a section of that, and we're going to look at Mark 16:6 and just a section of that. And so we're going to talk about that, talk about each one of those verses, and then we'll look at the focus will be in Mark 15:24, and we're going to look at three words this morning as we look at Jesus' death and resurrection. And so Mark 15:24, the words we want to look at here are, again, three. They crucified him. And we want to look at each one of these words individually for what they mean. So we start with they. Who are they? Who is they? Right? Who qualifies in this idea of they? And it's the Romans, of course, because they're the ones actually physically nailing Jesus to the cross. It's the Jews, too. They're the ones that wanted Jesus crucified for a heresy. But the one that's not in your face from the passage is that we are included in the they, right? Because it's our sin as well as their sin that Jesus is atoning for at the cross. He's paying our debt as much as he's paying the people who were actually there in the moment's debt as well. And that's a hard thing to understand. The responsibility of this is hard to understand because we're not alive. Like, I'm old. I wasn't alive in the first century. You definitely weren't alive in the first century. And so how are we guilty if we weren't even there? And one of the truths that we need to understand most of all is that Jesus' death and resurrection paid the price for all sins, right? Forward, backward, in the middle, the present, whatever. Jesus' death and resurrection pays for all of them. So our sin is dealt with at the same time everyone else's sin is dealt with. Hebrews 10:12 says it this way. It says, "But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sin, he then sat down at the right hand of God." So when we read the words, "They crucified him," we have to include ourselves because our sin, again, was paid for at the same time. And this is a good reminder, right? It's a good reminder of the distance between us and the Lord prior to us knowing him, and then the closeness of our relationship after the fact. And I want to be careful how I say this because I don't want you dwelling on what you were before you became a Christian, or if you have this guilt and this shame built up. I don't want you to be reminded of that. That's not what we're looking for here. The reminding is there was separation, now there's not separation. We were distant from God, now we're not distant from God because we've been freed from that and we're in relationship with Jesus. The reason I think it's important to remember it is it humbles us. Right? There's a lot of folks walking around and say, "Well, I've always been a good person, a good guy, I've always done the right thing, I've always followed the rules, and so what have I been saved from?" And that's important. That's why it's important to remember the distance, because it's easy for somebody like me who has this testimony of being a knucklehead and then coming to faith, and I get reminded of that and I get humbled. And it's for all of us to be in that place where the past, our past separation from God, is a reminder to how much God has transformed us. So, example of that, a few months ago I was walking around the square and I ran into an old college friend of mine. I hadn't seen her in 20-something years. Since we graduated from college, her and I hadn't talked. And so I was walking around, we ran into each other, started talking, and we're talking about family and all the things that kind of we've been up to, and she talks about her job, and then she says, so what do you do, and why are you up here? And I said, well, I work at that church over there, and I'm the youth pastor at StoneBridge Church, and she took this look of what? It was kind of this shocked look. I can't really even do the face because my beard gets in the way. But it was like this big, huge, shocking look of you. In her head, I can see her saying, "You work at a church? You're at a church?" And actually, what she really said to me was that I never pegged you for somebody who would do something like that. And that is super humbling. But the timing of it was perfect. I feel like every time I start walking in this arrogance of my faith, the Lord quickly reminds me of how far He's brought me, and it's humbling, and it's good, and it brings us closer together, and it makes my relationship with Him better. And so I say all of that to say this. We're included in the they, that they crucified Him. That's us. And it's a reminder of the distance that we once were from the Lord to the place where we are now, where we're much closer to Him. The second thing is crucified. They crucified. That word to us is in every Easter story that we've ever had, that we've ever talked about. And when I got up here, or when I started writing this yesterday, my whole plan was to write the most graphic description of what crucifixion was, mainly to shock you and to kind of make you feel a little bit uncomfortable with how gruesome it is. And I ran that idea by a couple of people, and so I've changed course. They thought it was a terrible idea, and so I decided not to do that. But I do want to give some context for what crucifixion is. Crucifixion was not just a way of executing. It was that. It was effective. It was not efficient. It was a long, drawn-out process, right? One to make it as painful as possible. But it was also one to display somebody, right? Most of the time a criminal, and Jesus was considered a criminal by the Jews at this point for being a heretic. And so his execution is on display, and it's meant to be embarrassing and humiliating. Not just painful, right? It's not just that you're in an excruciating pain, it's that it's to humiliate you, and it's also to instill fear among people all around you. You're walking down the road and you see someone hanging on this cross, you're going to be less likely to challenge the government at that point, because it's going to be one of the most excruciating things that you've ever witnessed, and it's going to instill fear. And Jesus' crucifixion wasn't any different. But I think the reason for the context, and actually the motivation behind wanting to give you the gruesome part that I left out, is that we would understand what the cross is. See, we hear this story so many times that Jesus died on a cross that we've kind of watered down what the cross is. We see it different places. I got one behind me right here. Probably walked by 5 people today who have a cross around their neck. You see it displayed all over the place. And for us, that says Christian, right? Most of the time. But if you lived in the first century, what that meant was fear. It meant power. It meant authority over you. It was to instill this fear, and that it was to be intense. And it wasn't a decoration, but it was an instrument of death. And I think it's important to know that. Because what Jesus did when He was crucified, He allowed His body to die so that we could be allowed into heaven and have a personal, permanent relationship with Him. That's a big deal. This thing that now that we look at and we kind of adore, if we look at it through the lens of the first century of this thing that should instill fear, it's Jesus transforming the relationship, right? That's a symbol of it. This goes from fear to love. Because Jesus wanted life with us. That Jesus Christ, the Son of God, right? God in the flesh, the one that healed the sick and raised the dead, He takes our guilt and shame. He takes our sin, and He chose to take it on Him because He wanted life with us. He wanted relationship with us. And on a day that we call Good Friday now, we crucified Him. And the result of that is permanent, personal relationship with Him. That's the last word. Him. Again, Jesus, the Son of God, met our greatest human need on Easter Sunday. He took all of our sin, and He was buried with it, and 3 days later, He rose, He left the grave. But what He left in the grave is as important as the fact that is as important as Him leaving the grave. He leaves death, sin, shame, guilt, all of those things. He leaves those in the grave, and He walks out. Those were all ours that He took, and He buried them. so that we can walk in freedom. And so he, the perfect Son of God, takes on the guilt and sin of the world and leaves it in the grave and rises again in 3 days so that all who accept the gift of salvation can be in relationship with him. That permanent personal relationship, it's easy to go there because all it requires from us is to accept the sacrifice. That's it. It's a simple thing to do. To say yes to him is simple. There's no hoops to jump through, right? It's just a simple saying yes. On Mark 16:6 says this, says he has risen. That's the one little part there. Good Friday, he dies and he takes all that stuff in the grave. Mark 16:6 is Easter Sunday. He has risen. He leaves that stuff in the grave and he walks out of it, making a path for us to be in relationship with him. And again, another Easter story, another thing, but the fact of the matter is this: yes, we crucified him. Yes, he did rise from the dead. And yes, we can be in relationship with him. And so this morning, it puts us, with Easter this morning, puts us in two camps, really. Most of you, as you're watching this, you're probably already a Christian, right? Or you are being, at this point in your life, being raised in the church. You may not have made the personal decision yet, but you're familiar with all of these things, and you're sitting there at your house right now watching this, hopefully with your parents, and you haven't made a decision to really accept the gift. Right? It's like, I don't know if I want to do this. I don't know. Like, do I lose cool points at school if I become a Christian? I used to love it back when I was teaching, that a bunch of kids would hang out in my room, and everybody that was not a believer would walk by and call them the Bible thumpers or the God squad. I loved it because it's like, if you're not on God squad, whose squad are you on? Seems like a really significant compliment to me. But maybe you're there like, I don't want to give up the relationships, or I don't want to give up how cool I am or how cool I think I am to follow after Jesus. But yet something has struck a chord in you this morning, and you need to talk to somebody about it. You've been going through the motions, and you've decided to make this decision to give your life to Jesus and to follow him. If that's where you are, I want you to talk to your parents about it. Your parents are your first pastor. They've been your pastor since you were born, and they will be your pastor for your entire life. They're your first point. They know everything about you, and they want to pray for you. We obviously don't have the ability for you to come up here and have me pray for you or small group leaders pray for you, but you have the best pastor that you could have in your life in the house with you right now. Your parents love you regardless. Share with them, I want to follow Jesus, and pray together as a family. And I want to encourage you all, pray together as a family. Pray with your parents. Pray for your parents. Take things to your parents for them to pray with you. This is a great time to be able to engage that relationship on a new way, right? You can't escape, so you might as well engage it. Share what's going on in your life. Have your parents pray for you. Pray for your parents. A praying relationship with your parents is something that you will lean on your entire life if you're there. So we want to encourage you to do that. Some of you are listening to this saying, we've done this before. This is another Easter Sunday sermon. I know this stuff, right? I know who Jesus is. I know what Jesus has done. He is Lord of my life. Why are we talking about this again? I've already made this commitment. And so I just have a simple question for you, and that's, who are you sharing it with? If you know it, and you know it's true, who are you sharing it with? Maybe your parents aren't Christians. Why not share it with them? Maybe one of your siblings. Y'all may go to church together, the same parents, the same church, but maybe one of your siblings is saying, I don't want that, and you're saying, I'm following Jesus. Are you sharing that with that sibling? Are you sharing it with that brother and sister? If you haven't made a decision for Jesus, this is an opportunity. Not a better day than Sunday, Easter Sunday. If you have made that decision, still not a better day or a better time to share that message. This whole idea of gospelized we've been talking about is the Easter message shared all over the place, all the time. So I want to encourage you to do that. Again, who are you sharing it with? I hope y'all have a great Easter. I hope you connect with your families, and I just pray for all of us and for you that this virus thing is over and that we can come back together as a group soon. So we're praying for you, and happy Easter.